that, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Eric Fournier. Dr. Eric Fournier is the research director at the California Center for Sustainable Communities. This is a center of excellence, I think, in the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Over the past decade, Eric has led numerous grant-funded research projects for a variety of state agency acronyms, including your favorites, CEC, CARB, CPUC, SGC, LADWP, and more. On a personal note, Dr. Fournier is my academic uncle, in a way, from the UCSB Bren School, and I'm very excited to welcome him to the stage. Please welcome Dr. Eric Fournier.
Thank you, Elise. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'll say a few brief words. Thanks to Elise and all the conference organizers here. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. It's exciting for me to share some of the insights from our research, but also to get a chance to learn more from you all about what's happening at the cutting edge of building energy modeling here in California. So I have three high-level objectives for my talk. The first, I want to spend a bit of time kind of introducing myself and the work of our research center. Next, I want to talk about the roles that building energy models play in California's ongoing energy transition. And I really want to do that primarily by introducing some examples of our research that we've been working on for the past several years at our center. So as a bit of a preview where I'm going to be going with that discussion, I'll just throw up a couple pieces of information about these projects. So two of them have been funded by the California Energy Commission, one that's focused on community scale energy transformations, and another that's related to long-term gas systems planning. Then I'll also be talking about some important work that we've been doing for CARB to support their ongoing efforts to develop zero emissions regulations for space and water heating. And then finally, I'll sort of conclude with some insights from a data access working group that we've been leading for the CPUC for the last 2 years or so. That's going to be wrapping up soon. So just first about me, I'm probably not a household name in this room, but I'm an associate researcher at the Institute for the Environment, UCLA. That means I do research essentially full-time, and I lead a professional sort of research team. Like a fair number of you, I'm sure, I spent most of my life in school. I started out really interested in building energy modeling. Actually, my honors thesis was a sort of big building energy modeling project for my university campus. Since then, I've sort of branched off. I've done a lot of work in GIS and life cycle assessment. But now at CCSC, I'm really focused on energy and water systems analysis. So our center is a soft money academic research center at UCLA. We really specialize in the use of big data to inform research questions in the energy, water, and systems. And so we're a little bit unconventional, I would say, as a research outfit, because our stated mission is really to do science in the public interest. So we're not just doing the standard academic research thing of publishing papers and standing back. We're getting into the mix. I typically use this graphic to sort of illustrate the different levels of the energy system that we focus on. You know, we look at things from the top down, also from the bottom up. And I was reflecting on this when I was looking at it. I was thinking to myself, where does building energy modeling fit in to this picture? It's actually not present anywhere. And it's something I want to sort of come back to, is like that the different points at which building energy models support decision-making by providing essential information in this system to make the system function. I think it's a really important thing to understand. Who are these models being used by, for what purposes? So I want to sort of circle back on that as I conclude. So as Elise mentioned, we do work at a lot of different levels. Historically, we had done a lot of work at the national level, but that's sort of rolling back with the changes in climate and environmental policy. So now we're sort of focusing much more at the regional level. We do the work for the RENs, helping with program sort of design and evaluation, and also increasingly directly with utilities. Specifically, we've been doing a lot of work with DWP around their plan for 100% renewable and pursuing that in an equitable fashion. I think one of the best ways to talk about sort of what we do generally is to speak to one of our sort of larger ongoing research initiatives, which we call the UCLA Energy Atlas. This really consists of kind of two sides. There are two faces to the Energy Atlas. On the one side, we have this really large private backend database of account level consumption for all of the investor-owned utility service territories for a number of years. We get this through a data sharing agreement with CPUC's Energy Division. So we store this on UCLA's campus. It's private. We access it for doing sort of big data analytics to support these different research projects. But we also sort of have public websites and data that we publish based on different types of aggregations from that confidential data that I just referred to. And these we make public in the form of interactive websites that we develop for different stakeholder groups. They're context enhanced, so we're basically taking the consumption data and linking it to parcel attributes, building attributes, data from the census, all kinds of different sources. So, I'm sorry, the graphic didn't come out great. Yeah, so essentially, we're using the confidential data to do the typical research things. We're writing reports, we're publishing papers, but we're also doing this public work. We're getting into the mix. We're participating in CPUC proceedings. We're sort of writing comment letters for different pieces of legislation. We actually do projects for local municipalities for, to support climate action planning, and we help sort of lead LA County's first sustainability plan. So we're doing a number of different things, and I think this is sort of reflects our mission to do science in the public interest. And so as I mentioned, sort of technically, it's all about enriching this data with context. If any of you actually have heard of SCE's effort, the Building Integrated Geospatial Database, what we're doing is very much analogous to that, except I would argue at a larger scale, and it also spans gas consumption for the gas utility providers in the state. So just as a quick plug, if anybody wants, this is interesting, you want to see some of these public products, just go to your browser, search UCLA Energy Atlas, you'll see some fun interactive tools. So with that sort of brief introduction about myself and CCSC, I just want to talk briefly about California's decarbonization strategy, because I think it's really important to sort of set the table about the different discussions that we're going to be having today, and also around some of the research projects that I'm going to be talking about. The state's decarbonization strategy has kind of three core pillars, right? The first is to increase the proportion of energy that's supplied to the power system from qualifying clean and renewable sources. The second is to improve the energy efficiency of buildings and installed end-use equipment. And the third is really to substitute all remaining fossil fuel end uses, primarily via electrification. And so each of these pillars really quite directly maps to kind of a marquee policy initiative that has a lot of downstream implications. So the first is the SB 100, the Renewable Portfolio Standard. The second is very familiar to the folks in this room, the CE's Title 24 Building Energy Codes. And the third is actually coming online right now with CARB's work to implement zero emissions technology standards. And they're really focusing quite a bit on space and water heating as their the first end uses that they want to tackle. And so we've been working quite closely with them in that process. So in part because of those decarbonization policies, but also due to some exogenous factors like the emergence of these massive new AI data centers, it really looks like for the first time in decades we're seeing significant growth in the long-term electricity load forecasts. And there's a lot of uncertainty, too, in terms of what's going to happen with gas demand. So we're going to have to wait and see, really, about how much of this anticipated load growth materializes. But I think it does place renewed emphasis on the role of efficiency and conservation measures, particularly within buildings, to offset the need for new capacity expansion, both in terms of generation, but also transmission distribution. And this is echoing some of the comments that Josh made about sort of the importance of it. If we pull back and think a bit about the high-level objective of all of this decarbonization work, it really boils down to achieving GHG emissions reductions. So this is data from CARB, sort of showing how we've been doing at the state level over the last 20 years. We've made some significant progress. They like to talk about GHG reductions sort of normalized in terms of GDP, but the reality is the climate doesn't really care about GHG emissions per unit GAP. It's just you got to reduce GHG emissions. So if we look at where we need to get to in terms of state goals, again, as Josh said, progress really needs to accelerate. And the sort of maybe $100 billion question is whether or not each marginal unit of emissions abatement is going to get easier or cheaper to achieve or get more expensive, right? So will there be sort of diminishing returns to that effort, or will you get increasing returns because of learning and scale? We just don't know, right? That's the thing, we're sort of at this unique position. Right now, what we sort of do know, we can say confidently, is that the energy system is entering a period of really dramatic and probably accelerating transportation. And this graphic kind of, it plays on the well-worn analogy of, we're trying to do more than just, fix or repair the engine mid-flight. Like we're trying to replace the engine of the plane with something that's fundamentally different, right? That operates on different physical principles, that has more performance. And at the same time, we're increasing sort of the demands on the system in terms of its performance and reliability. So it's really, the stakes are quite high in terms of what's going to be happening over the next decade or two. So what roles do building energy models play in this transition? Fundamentally, I view building energy models as a means of supporting decision-making under uncertainty, right? That's like essentially what they're doing. And their outputs are really essential for understanding the energy, the bill, the GHG reductions that you can expect from implementing different types of building transformations. And so for that reason, they're really important in terms of the financialization of energy efficiency and fuel substitution programs, evaluating different design alternatives in new construction, and assessing the trade-offs that appear kind of at the large scale in terms of energy system planning efforts. So with that said, I think something that we all have to be very vigilant about is resisting the temptation to use model outputs as sources of truth, right? Models are really most useful in helping us to understand how or why things happen, but measurements from customer meters or other sensors, those are always going to be essential for understanding what actually did happen. And I think one of the high-level themes that I want to get to is we need to figure out better ways to leverage the vast ocean of measurement data that's continuously being collected from customer meters, really to help improve the accuracy and the effectiveness of different building energy models. I think it's really, really important. Now, while I think while there's a lot of value in pursuing code improvements that apply to new construction, I think the impacts of those efforts are really going to be limited by the rate at which that new construction is occurring. So there's a huge imperative to continue to improve the energy efficiency of existing buildings. And this is something that I think needs to happen in parallel as we push hard to electrify different end uses, right, with all this type of new end use equipment. Because you'd really hate to see the gains associated with, a very expensive new heat pump system be eroded by installing that heat pump system in sort of a leaky building, right, with poor insulation, right? It's just that doesn't seem like a smart investment. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears now, and I guess I'm going to talk more about these specific projects, and hopefully these touch upon these different themes. So the first of these is something I've been working on, honestly, for almost a decade now. I started as a postdoc in the first phase of this project, which is a CEC-funded sort of planning project that we later won a second phase of implementation funds, and we call it BAEC, B-A-A-E-C, the Bassett Avocado Heights Advanced Energy Communities Project. So this is sort of the program website for BAEC. BAEC is a voluntary program that has a number of different scopes. It is technically conceived of as a CEC-funded technical demonstration project. It was only eligible to qualifying households within a specific geographic area. It's located in unincorporated Los Angeles County. But the high-level objective of the program is to develop a scalable approach to deploying advanced distributed energy resource and fuel substitution technologies, specifically within hard-to-reach, historically disadvantaged community homes. And so you can see sort of this is the rough geography. This area is very close to the city of industry. It's kind of nestled into the La Puente Hills landfill. It's crisscrossed by a number of major freeways that are taking truck traffic from the port. They have high pollution burdens. There's a lot going on. This is not typically an area where you would see people getting, rooftop solar or batteries or advanced sort of high efficiency energy equipment in their homes. So the project sort of has sprawling scope. I'm only going to talk about actually two pieces that I think are most relevant to this group. We were involved, as I said, on the front end in sort of conceptualizing like what it means to be an advanced energy community in this context. We're now involved on the back end. We're doing all the EM&V work to verify and measure that the program was effective in terms of meeting its goals. Number of different partners. The lead was the Energy Coalition, which is a nonprofit that works on program implementation. The two scopes that I want to focus on, I think, are relevant to this group is the advanced home scope. So this was basically a home DER and fuel substitution program that had zero upfront cost to participate. So if you were a low-income household in this community that were interested in this program, you were eligible to potentially get, for zero cost, like upwards of $150,000 of investment in your home in terms of new energy equipment. The measures were optional. Everybody had to at least get solar, but you could also choose to get a battery energy storage system, which was 2 Tesla Powerwalls, a heat pump water heater. You would replace your existing gas water heater, as well as an induction stove. We ran into every kind of challenge you could imagine in terms of the recruitment for this program. We had a target. It was a pilot, so we had a target of getting 50 people enrolled. We ended up getting 34. Part of that was due to in-person outreach really being affected by the COVID pandemic. We also had a pretty dramatic change in the financial structure of the program due to the shift from NEM 2.0 to NEM 3.0 in the middle of the implementation. And then also a big thing that we found was that a lot of the people that qualified, like the income qualifications for the programs, were really living in buildings that were in a state of disrepair. So 19 of these 34 households had to have complete roof replacements to be structurally able to hold the rooftop solar in order to participate. 22 of them needed panel upgrades because they had less than 100 amps. So it's really sort of challenging, but also very insightful to see all of the challenges that you have to overcome when you if somebody wants to participate, you try to do everything you can to overcome the barriers that they're encountering. As I said, we're doing the EM&V, so we've been we're not quite there yet in finishing the reports, but we've got some preliminary results. We've been looking at what the net change in GHG emissions were across both gas and electricity consumption. So we're calculating using marginal electricity emissions intensities from the grid, and also using avoided emissions from substituted gas use. What we're finding is that for the majority of people, the majority of the time, you can achieve pretty significant GHG emissions reductions if you couple fuel substitution with distributed energy resources. And that's true too with respect to bills, which are honestly the most important thing for these types of households. These are just showing on a monthly basis the distribution of bill savings. If you're above that horizontal line there, that means that you had positive bill savings when you add up the totals between your gas and electricity bill. So again, for the majority of people, the majority of the time, we were able to provide them with pretty significant savings off what their monthlies would be. But there still are these odd cases where people had reduction or bill increases for a period of time, and that's kind of a source of uncertainty that I think building energy modeling can be really effective at teasing out. Right? It's like, well, we can broadcast this broad message that most people are going to benefit this program, but if we're able to identify the specific people that might not, that's going to help a lot, right? So another scope I think is a little bit more peripheral, but I think still interesting, is we had a community solar component. We built 2 fairly large solar systems on a self-storage facility in this neighborhood, and we enrolled them in the Clean Power Alliance, the local CCA. Their pilot, actually I think it's the Community Solar Green Tariff Project, but it's basically 670 kilowatts. And the idea was can we find a way to get the benefits of net metering and net billing tariffs to renter households that don't own their property, that can install solar, but might like to see bill reductions. So basically the way that this works is you build an array, and then they get enrolled customers in the program get an automatic 20% on bill savings. And that was really successful. This is the first of its kind in front of the meter generation resource aggregation that was connected to the CAISO system. So this is the first time you ever had multiple sites that were kind of grouped together that participated in the wholesale market, built in an urban area, on rooftops, and benefiting local households. So as far as this project, some of the key takeaways, we played I would say, an instrumental role in providing insights like statistical analysis of the actual usage for these types of eligible customers, that the team, this broader team, used to sort of calibrate their building modeling efforts. And those building modeling efforts were really essential in sort of making like a convincing financial case that the program would pencil. I think without that, like without our involvement, and also, you know, we did a number of things in terms of like they're trying to spin up a virtual power plant with the battery systems, you know, they would have been flying a little bit blind because these types of disadvantaged community households are very different from your normal household across the board. Okay, so another project I think is quite relevant to y'all is CalBEM's ongoing work to develop zero-emission space and water heating regulations. Maybe a show of hands, how many people are aware of that this is coming down the pipeline? Hopefully a lot of you, right? This is going to be a big change. So CalBEM is deep in this process. They sort of, you know, ran a series of public workshops and have been doing kind of back-end analysis to assess the cost and the feasibility of implementing different types of regulations to essentially eliminate combustion from space and water heating. They're starting with residential, but moving to small commercial and large commercial fairly quickly after that. Right now, they're sort of in the final processes of crafting the regulations, and then there's going to be a final ruling and hopefully a period of compliance implementation that starts later on in that. As I mentioned, you know, one of the things that CalBEM's really wrestling with is the uncertainty in terms of like the net present value of these types of technologies for different types of, you know, customers, businesses. There was a really sort of a big study that came out of one of the national labs that got a lot of press that kind of highlighted this, sort of like the big scale message is that most people are going to benefit from the adoption of heat pumps, but not everybody, right? And so if you're at like the tail of this distribution, you could have sort of really significantly negative net present values, which is not a good thing, right? And so again, I think that this is a huge opportunity for the building energy modeling community to kind of parse out the winners from the losers in terms of, you know, potential adoption of these different types of new technologies. A big issue that I don't know is necessarily being captured well in terms of the building energy modeling tools that are out there relate to the structural barriers associated with implementing fuel substitution technologies in existing buildings. And there's a lot of constraints that people have to navigate, and they really boil down to like adding costs, fixed costs to these types of things. So some of these that have, you know, are potentially really important are, you know, the need to upgrade or optimize around the capacity of an existing electrical panel, maybe upgrade the service entrance, reconfigure spaces to support technology with a different physical footprint. You know, CalBEM is really trying to understand like how many buildings are not going to be able to fit the new heat pump water heater into the space where the old gas tank was, right? Like those are really challenging problems. And sort of understanding what the cost of making those modifications are if you're working in sort of a simulated environment, a building energy model, might actually be really useful. So I don't know if this is a space that is being addressed in terms of like navigating these types of constraints, but this is really where the rubber's hitting the road in terms of like quantifying the challenges associated with doing this. We spent a lot of time, I spent the last 2 years of my life, just trying to quantify like what is the size distribution of electrical service panels in the state of California in residential buildings. It turns out nobody really knows. The utilities don't know. They consider it to be sort of on the customer side of the meter. They just know what the service drops capacity is rated to be. So we developed a whole analysis by pulling permit data from different municipalities. Essentially what we were trying to do is just quantify like how many households, residential households, single family households have panels, have panels that are sort of below 100 amps. Because below 100 amps, like it's really challenging to do full-scale electrification without dealing with capacity constraints on the panel side, either upgrading the panel or doing some kind of optimization. Good news is that we think there's less than 3%, but there's a pretty sizable number that are kind of in this intermediate size, which is like 100 to 150 amps, which is like you have to make some trade-offs probably, right? If you're going to be electrifying all the end uses in your home. You may have to use things like circuit splitters, right? To like simultaneously, or to choose between doing EV charging or say running your new heat pump dryer at the same time. You can't do those things necessarily simultaneously if you're power constrained with your panel. And so there's lots of different technologies that are coming out, that are sort of emerging from startups and different firms now, but I don't know if they're well represented in terms of like the models and the model libraries and what you can do. And I think that's going to be really important. And it sort of speaks to a broader theme, I would say, which is that most building energy modeling frameworks are not really well designed for solving for these types of constraints. Sort of like, you bring me the design that you want me to evaluate, and I'll tell you how it works, as opposed to like, well, what are the limits that you're working into? You're working around, let me tell you what some potential solutions are. I know there are some parametric modeling frameworks that get out of that, but I think it's just a really important thing, because it's exactly the type of problem that property owners are facing, right? If you're going to be staring down the barrel of a new regulation that's requiring you substitute your gas equipment on burnout, it's like, well, how do I navigate all these constraints that I have in my particular building? And I think having some models that help people do that in a sort of very streamlined, easy way would be really valuable. And so, these are just some of the goals that people have. I don't want to increase my operational energy expenditures. I don't want to exceed my panel capacity. I don't want to require major structural modifications to the building or the way that spaces are programmed. I don't want to compromise thermal comfort. All of these types of things, it would be really nice if the model outputs could present us with viable solutions that sort of guarantee this or provide a strong sort of possibility of that. So the flip side of all of this electrification work, right, is thinking about what happens to the gas system if we're successful. And this is actually really important and something that not a lot of people have been talking about for a long time, but people are becoming much more interested in this. And we've been thinking about this within the scope of another CEC project where we've been building kind of an interactive tool to screen potential sites for gas decommissioning projects. So there's a really excellent paper that came out in 2021 in a law review of all places. I really strongly recommend that folks look this up. It's an eye-opening paper. It's sort of, how do we shut down a system that was designed to last forever? Because that's kind of how the gas system was built. And there's a lot of really eye-opening statistics in here, but the sort of bottom line is that there's an enormous volume of gas distribution infrastructure in this country that's under the ground that is still being built, hasn't yet paid for itself in most instances, and we have no plan for how to move away from it in a sort of structured manner that's not going to leave stranded costs. This author's estimate that's, the value of that infrastructure is upwards of $160 billion across the United States. It could be higher. So what is the challenge here? So this kind of illustrates sort of this vicious feedback loop that can occur. So you have an aging gas infrastructure that has sort of rising commodity costs in some cases. That can lead to higher gas rates. You're also adding in sort of market forces that are leading to economic building electrification. And then you have climate policies like those zero emissions regulations I was just describing, all of which leading to sort of falling gas demand. So you get less gas retail sale. But you have fixed costs to maintain that infrastructure, right? So you're now selling less gas through this very extensive distribution infrastructure, and you're sort of reducing your ability to sort of recoup the cost of maintaining it. And so that leads to higher gas rates, right, which drives this cycle, and they call it sort of the gas death spiral. Trust me, a lot of the gas utilities are really concerned about this. CEC's, their most recent internal modeling basically says if you do nothing about this, if you just sort of let that infrastructure continue to be maintained in the way that it has been, over the next 20 or 30 years, you're going to see really dramatic escalation in gas rates because you basically just have to charge the remaining customers more for the gas that they're receiving, right, to maintain the fixed costs of that infrastructure. And so what's the solution to this? Well, basically, essentially boils down to you have to start strategically decommissioning some of that infrastructure, right? So you have to go into certain areas, you have to identify groups of customers and say, we're going to fully electrify everything here, or we're going to otherwise substitute the use of gas, and then we're going to take that infrastructure offline and no longer have to pay to maintain it. So we're sort of CEC starting to get ahead of this. We were sort of tasked with developing kind of a GIS tool that would help to identify promising sites for these types of projects. We thought sort of comprehensively about this problem and boiled this down to sort of a different set of indices that respected different sort of goals associated with those projects. And we had sort of a residential, non-residential sort of readiness metrics. We also had metrics that would reflect like the equity benefits of the projects, and then obviously the conditions or the cost benefits associated with the different gas assets. In the process of doing this, what we realized is like there's really not good kind of mesoscale modeling tools that allow you to look at like an arbitrary group of customers and say, what would be their net costs associated with like full electrification. It doesn't really exist. And we need that because we need those modeling tools to start to draw boundaries around groups of customers that are like the neighborhoods of the infrastructure, right? So like people that are served by a specific piece of gas infrastructure that can be hydraulically isolated from the rest of the network without being dangerous. So I think this is sort of, the next 10 or 15 years, there's going to be a lot of demand for like tools that sort of do mesoscale like electrification feasibility studies with building energy models. So one of the high-level takeaways, this is not obvious, and this is something we're trying to communicate to CARB, is like there are places where electrification should be pursued much more aggressively, and it really should be done comprehensively, because partial electrification can lead to unwanted outcomes for retail gas customers. Because if you're only electrifying selective end uses, what are you doing? So if you take space and water heating out of the equation, right, in a residential context, that's like upwards of 70 to 80% of the gas use on site. Great, so you now have a few gas uses still remaining, you've retained your gas hookup, and you're selling 80% less of the commodity to that customer, but you have the same costs, right? So partial electrification is kind of dangerous from the gas system perspective, because it sort of leads naturally that sort of doom spiral I was just describing. Okay, so that's the gas system. I think that's something that, just an awareness of infrastructure constraints and the needs of the infrastructure is going to be something that building energy modeling community should start to pay much more attention to in the future. I'm going to sort of close the fourth project. How am I doing on time? Okay. The fourth project is something that we've been doing for the CPUC for the last, I would say, almost 2 years, and we've been working on a report that's wrapping up very quickly soon. This is facilitating stakeholder discussions around approaches to improving access to customer data that's collected by the utilities, basically meter bill data and other customer attributes like participation in programs and whether they have distributed energy resources installed or other load modifying equipment. It's interesting to sort of step back from this and think about the fact that like the metering of utility customer consumption data was really one of like the first ever big data applications. Like some of these really large databases like were really originally designed to solve this problem, collecting that information. Yet for a variety of reasons, these data are difficult to access still for folks that are outside the utilities. So in your all community, the modeling community, it would be really nice, right, to have more streamlined access to customer usage data to calibrate models, right, or to verify that the results of models are correct. I view the situation as kind of like, as a state, we're trying to go on a diet, and we have the scale, and we're constantly measuring our weight, but we refuse to sort of look at what that measurement is, or we're unable to do so for a variety of reasons. It's actually kind of amazing to think of the lengths that we've gone to sort of work around these barriers to data access. I was looking into it a number of years ago. Joshua New gave a talk here. He's at ORNL and leads the sort of Model America effort, right? And I think of that like, isn't it amazing that we were able to sort of use supercomputers and all this advanced satellite imagery to make building energy models for 138 million buildings in the United States, but we can't get access to the actual metered consumption data from like 3,000 utilities, right? That's a harder thing to do. It's a bigger lift. I just think that's fascinating, right? Obviously, there's many other applications associated with like a Model America type effort. It's hugely impressive, but it's really frustrating, right? That like we have all this good metered consumption data and we're not able to use it for the purposes of calibration. Changes are afoot, okay? So there's something called Section 1353 of Title 20 of the California Code of Standards, which basically was a new authorization for the Energy Commission to start to receive a sort of automated transfer of all of the interval data being collected by all of the IOUs. And so CEC, over the past several years, has been building a pipeline to ingest this data on a quarterly basis, very detailed data for all the customers, and store it in sort of a warehouse, like a big data lake. And they've been thinking about what they're going to do with this, right? So obviously CEC is going to be using it internally to support their forecasting applications, but there's a lot of interest and ideas for how you could use that data externally, right? And so a natural example of that would be sort of developing APIs that would provide somebody that was in the modeling community with more direct access to the historical consumption for either a specific customer or a specific sort of class of customers, right, that they could be used as a means of calibration for their energy model. And so, you know, CEC is actually just starting the process of thinking of how to open up this data access. They've not yet implemented any APIs, but they have something called the Energy Data Analysis Program, which is skewed towards a specific class of users, specifically local governments. And the way that they're thinking about this is creating like designated agents. So if you're a private company that's going to be working with like a municipal government to do like a climate action plan, then you can be a designated agent for the CEC, pass a number of sort of cybersecurity kind of controls, verifications, and then get direct access to this like massive Snowflake database that they built. That's sort of, you can query by individual accounts, right? And you can do that as a contractor for those municipal governments. So I think this is like the sort of proto version of something that could ultimately become kind of more of a broader API access that provides, you know, members of your community more streamlined ways of getting a hold of the energy consumption data you need to improve your modeling work. I think that could be really important, but you need to advocate for it, right? So the folks at CEC need to know that this would be a beneficial thing to do, and we also need to think through ways to make, you know, whatever solution they might stand up or program they might stand up sort of be able to stand on its own 2 feet, be sort of self-sufficient financially and administratively. Okay, so that's sort of the review of kind of our center, our projects, and some things I think connect to the work that you're all doing. I just wanted to sort of close and think about sort of a little bit of musings about how energy models can be improved going forward. But before I do that, I wanted to circle back to this figure because I think I have an answer. So model results are sort of can be thought of as a lubricant of change at every level of the system. If you don't have model results and you're operating in this sort of domain of complete uncertainty, nothing is going to change. People will just sort of continue with the status quo. So I think it's super important, and it's like it would almost be redundant to try to plot where the model results fit in, because it's like at every level. They're being used at the top level, at the bottom level, intermediately. So it's like it's hugely important, the work that you guys are all doing in this room. It's like I said, it's the lubricant of change for the system. With that said, I think that in order to further increase the utilization and the impact of building energy models, we've got to continue to find ways to reduce the cognitive load that they place on users. And I was, just before the talk here today, I was talking with Steve, and he was saying, have you heard of the model context protocol and using LLMs to sort of parametrically stand up these models? It's like, that's a great way to do this, right? It just makes it much easier to set up sort of a well-parameterized model that you can start playing with. Another way of doing it is to just much more aggressively pull relevant contextual information about buildings and their energy use from different sources. And so some of those may not exist yet. You have to advocate for them, building APIs that the model can talk to. But hopefully we can get to a place where, you know, understanding what the historical energy use of a building was and is would be sort of, you know, having a property owner authorize consent on their phone, you plugging in an address, and then you're able to connect to a database automatically to pull that information into your model. The same way you might do with like a weather file or something like that. Like all you have to know is where you are. Another way to improve sort of the utilization, the impact of these models is to automatically convert that type of contextual information into sort of realistic design constraints. So what are things that folks are going to have to navigate if they want to do X, Y, and Z? I think that's really important. That's maybe more of a fundamental sort of architectural shift in the way that models are designed, but I think folks are calling for that. wouldn't it be nice if our models were better equipped to present users with different feasible solutions to choose from, as opposed to requiring them to first propose those solutions and then, seeing if their feasibility can be assessed. So that's sort of my high-level vision, and I think that's about it as far as my talk, and I'll maybe open it up for questions for folks. I'm happy to discuss anything here.
Go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring the mic to you.
Jim Lutz. You talk about CARB and the zero emission appliances, but you didn't mention South Coast Air Quality Management District and the Bay Area Air District. Was there a reason you didn't mention those?
So the districts are pursuing their own individual strategies for those regulations, and they're kind of being used as a test bed for CARB for regs that would be superseding and applicable statewide. So CARB is learning a lot from sort of, I would say, feedback / pushback that they're receiving from different parties through the public engagement processes related to the specific district regulations. I think basically the way it would work is the districts would be allowed to implement regs that were more stringent than the statewide regs, but any other district would default to the statewide reg that would come in. So yeah, I could talk at length about sort of the individual rules that have been coming in, and sort of, I think what's more interesting is the phasing requirements in terms of like, what's the timeline, what is the mechanism, what are for like when you have to actually come into compliance, is that tiered for different types of customers based upon income levels, things like that. We've actually just started getting involved with doing some of these types of feasibility assessment investigations for CARB focused on commercial properties. And the default strategy that CARB's been using as far as the reg implementation is like, okay, set some sort of hourly BTU rate cap for applicable equipment, right, that you would substitute. So like, if you're using less than 1 million BTUs per hour in this device, right, then you fall under the need to replace on burnout with a zero emission substitute. I think that replacement on burnout strategy doesn't make much sense in the context of like larger commercial buildings, with much more sophisticated kind of solutions and systems that may even be bespoke at some level, and that requires like a whole long capital allocation and sort of project implementation, like planning effort. You can't just like replace this stuff on burnout, So we're trying to just think through like, what's a feasible implementation strategy for different types of end-use equipment in different subsectors, specifically like commercial subsectors. And that's something that I don't know if any individual sort of air district has tackled, because they're mostly focused on like small-scale residential right now, where the technologies are most mature.
Hi, Daryl Kelly here. I am an energy consultant here in California and spend probably 70% of my time looking for solutions for my clients. I have to go out and look in 5, 6, 7 different databases. I have to go to a dozen different websites. I have to talk to the engineers, and then I get pushback from everybody. And every time I want to make a change, it's an iteration. The modeling software needs to be developed so that it does that kind of agentic work that LLMs are good at doing, because it's the same thing over and over again. And I'm wondering if anybody is working toward integrating LLMs into compliance software.
I'm not the expert on that. I was looking at the conference agenda. I know there are discussions about LLMs. I think Steve might, no, unless you have a question. I think that's sort of the frontier of innovation in this space, right, is the application of those technologies to, as I said, like alleviate the cognitive load that is placed on you as a user of a model to demonstrate that this set of choices is sort of feasible, sane, and is going to provide benefits. I'm excited by that. You know, I'm generally not a person who's super bullish on a lot of the LLM applications, but as you said, I do think this is like a niche instance where what LLMs do well is well suited to that task. So hopefully that's something that can come.
Yeah, Steve Cromer. I'm here to learn about that, frankly, from all of you on the code side and how LLMs can work that. But I've had really great success in the last month running the MCP on Energy Plus. It's really exciting. But while you're up here giving us a bigger picture, I really appreciate the overview. When you show that diagram of the top-down platform, and I think everyone in here is interested in energy and environment, but we also have health, we have insurance, we have a lot of other people that access all this data as well, and we don't often think about that. Like, how are our buildings? Who else? Like, even in Sacramento, do you know of anything like that? The other groups that are thinking about this as broadly and other purposes for modeling indoor air quality, bringing that data into our models and showing improved conditions and stuff?
Yeah, that's it's interesting, right? So we did a project a couple of years ago for CEC where we were trying to calculate some of the co-benefits of fuel substitution measures, right? Specifically related to like avoided both indoor air pollution and ambient air pollution. So indoor would be like you removed your gas combusting device in the home. Let's say it's a stove or a range. You replaced it with an induction version of it. So you've sort of reduced the indoor loading of criteria pollutants for the households. But now you've potentially, if you're doing that at scale, right, you're potentially changing the pattern of load at the system level, and you could be engaging different classes of generators at different times that would be creating ambient emissions somewhere else, right? And so you might potentially, before you fully, shift it to renewable power or clean power, created a hotspot or amplified the sort of ambient pollution load somewhere else. So it's actually like, and with that, so you now have this sort of like more sophisticated energy system level modeling problem that you're trying to solve. It's like, what is the response of the grid to this new load that occurs at a new time that's maybe never happened before, right? So there's no precedent for like, well, what generator would fire up at that time? Like, we don't know. Added on top of that, you're inheriting all the complexity of a sort of public health / fate transport study, right? So you have like, well, what is the sort of, the thing that we struggle with is like, what's the acceptable threshold concentration levels for indoor air pollution for certain classes of pollutants related to gas combustion? Turns out there are no indoor standards, right? There are only ambient standards. So you got this sort of uncertainty there, like, well, what is safe for people to sort of, how do you quantify the benefits of that? And at the higher level, let's say you do calculate what the system was going to do and where you're going to get, the peaker plants firing up. Well, where are those emissions going to go, right? Which way is the wind blowing? So I think the challenge is you're stacking and inheriting the complexities of all of the different levels of the system, and it very quickly becomes unwieldy because the compounding uncertainty or the compounding difficulty of reining in that uncertainty. So I think it's not that people aren't interested in it, it's just like it's fundamentally hard, right? It's just fundamentally hard.
I was wondering if you can expand on the panel capacity predictions that you were talking about. Is that based on actual data collection, or is it?
Yeah, so yes, so I can talk a little bit. The paper's open access, and I'd be happy to follow up. It gets sort of involved, but methodologically, basically what we did is we had a parcel database for the entire state, right? So we know what the construction vintage is for every one of the properties that we're trying to predict. Now, historical evolutions in the National Electrical Code would have suggested that at certain times of construction, certain types of property would most likely have a panel of a certain size, right? That gives you kind of initial starting point for like, well, what was the panel size most likely looking like at the time of construction? Down the road, you know, a lot of our buildings are quite old now, right? There's peak of construction in the sort of post-war era, but you've got buildings going back to like, you know, the early 1900s in many cases. And it's very likely that their energy infrastructure has been upgraded over time, right? So we're trying to basically understand like what is the cadence of that upgrade process and how does that differ in different locations. So we used, we basically pulled a large corpus of, from building departments at different municipal levels, a large corpus of permit data, flagged instances where they had done a panel upgrade, and then used that to develop sort of a probability distribution function that was conditional upon sort of other characteristics of the location, like, you know, sociodemographics. And we applied those probability functions to like a biased coin flip. So what is the likelihood that the panel was upgraded from its original sort of size at the time of construction, and what was the jumps in terms of like these normal panel sizes that you likely encountered based upon the outcome of that conditional flip. So it's sort of like a probabilistic statement, but it kind of, it does mesh very well with other sources of data that are being collected from like surveys. You know, just asking people like, how big is your panel? Tell me about your home, these types of things. There's problems with all these different ways of collecting that type of information. You need to kind of be an expert, honestly, to even look at a panel and understand what its capacity is and things like that. So we tried to take a different approach to provide, you know, a fundamentally new estimate based on a new method that could be used to triangulate these other estimates that have their own sources of uncertainty because of the limits of the methods. Yeah.
Hi, I'm in Lasrak. You mentioned, I think, in the first study that some homes, they didn't like benefit from the upgrades. I'm curious, did you investigate trying to understand why and if there was like a trend? And
yeah, so there's, I guess what I would say is there's lots of different sources of change. There's, in that particular project, right, there's a very important nuance that I didn't get to because of time, which is that, you know, I think in our, maybe some of us commit this fallacy. I think I did, coming to this program implementation kind of world from an academic's perspective, but it's like, okay, we started the program on this date, everybody got sort of the same package of measures, the measures all got implemented on the same day for all the participant customers. It's like, that's totally not true, right? Like, you have this bleed out of like, okay, this customer got this thing first, and then they had to wait for 3 months to get permission to operate it. And then they got this other set of things in a different order from the other customers. And so the evaluation period for each customer is not really the same. And that can, depending on what the mix is of the measures that you're looking at, and when you're evaluating those things. So like solar is going to give you the most benefits in terms of your bill reductions in a certain part of the year. And your fuel substitution measures are going to hit you the hardest in terms of your electricity load growth and bill impacts in another part of the year. And if you don't have good overlap in terms of your period of performance across all the different customers, that's going to show up as noise a little bit, right? It's like, oh, this person got their heat pump heater in, but their solar would have offset a lot of the bill impacts associated with that, but the solar only came in later or whatever due to the vagaries of implementation. So some of that we were just like technically limited in terms of the historical consumption data that we had access to for evaluating program performance. We only get 3 years of data from the utilities. And it takes like 6 months to go through the process of accessing that data under the current procedures. So if you have a program with 5 different measures and it took you maybe a year or a year and a half to implement all 5, right, that really eats into your pre and post periods of performance and creates these like alignment issues which show up as what I would describe as noise. So I try to just emphasize on like looking at the mean of those signals because it's just a challenge associated with like normalized meter or energy consumption based EM&V, like ex post techniques. I think we're getting close to time. In terms of the participants in that particular program, or just generally like work that we do? Yeah. Yeah, so I've seen, I should forward you an interesting study. There was a group of colleagues of ours that work at USC that got access to really quite a large, like statistically representative sample of interval usage data in Southern California. And they were originally looking at like trying to identify from the interval data like AC penetration rates. But they ended up in standing up the technical methods to sort of do those like difference in difference studies. They had a really interesting result. It was like 50% of the variation that they could observe that was not explained by the structural factors that they could control for must be due to just like who's in the homes, right? So like in any given property, like 50% of the variation that you might see in the energy use is like just from behaviors, right? And that's like really profound. That could be partially due to difference in occupancy, right? But also I think behavior is just a really significant component. And I think that's a thing that is probably the strongest argument for improving access to actual metered data, is that you're isolating for that behavioral variation, right? It's like, well, it's not just some representative sample of homes that are similar to this or properties. It's like, it's this home with whoever's living in it and whatever they choose to do or how they do it. So I don't know if that's something you'll ever be able to fully wrap your head around, with any other kind of data without running into really gross privacy concerns in terms of like the way that you're characterizing the people that live in those or live or occupy those properties. I think for me it's like the biggest argument for getting actual meter data is controlling for that variation. Yeah, right. And I think there's also like there's a known unknown there, which is sort of particularly with heat pumps. For many people, if you're coming from a situation where you didn't previously have cooling, right? The heat pump is introducing a fundamentally new class of energy service that you don't know what the demand is for in that property, right? And it's just like, oh, well, yes, the heat pump is now sort of solving my heating needs much more effectively, but it's just opened up this Pandora's box of me using it for cooling, and sort of could be blowing up your calculations around sort of savings on the basis of that alone, right? So I think that's a hard thing, because like you're presenting somebody with, a means of consumption they've never had access to, and the only way to know what their demand for it is to observe what it ended up being, and what the realized activity was when they had that option to press the button when it's hot and cool themselves down, So I think that's a really big X factor. But it's also probably one of the biggest selling points of that technology for folks is the prospect of cooling, particularly in sort of the climate we're entering into. Yeah. Right. Right. And you probably have better zonal control if you had a mini split system, right? You can sort of just like isolate one room in a lot of cases. But I think we're to stay on schedule. We're out of time, so thanks so much to everybody. Sorry, I didn't see.
Yeah, sorry, Gabe Taylor, Energy Commission. Really appreciate your interest in our interval meter database, and we've been putting a lot of effort into cleaning that up and smoothing out the transfer of the data and then making it into a useful data lake, as you call it. Do you have any top-of-mind use cases for that data? We're exploring that, trying to define those use cases so that we can move forward with implementing.
Top of mind, yeah. So as I said, we've been working sort of on EM&V for this CEC-funded technical demonstration project. We have to go through the utilities energy data request program to get the interval data to do that, right? We're burning staff dollars from research funds to get access to this data that CEC has through a much more arduous pathway. So I think it would be great if in every research project that CEC funds, where there could be an EM&V component that could benefit from access to consumption data, they scope out a little bit of budget, right, to support the internal mechanics of getting all those teams access to that data, to at least for their own research, right? At least, minimally. That seems like, because otherwise you're spending that money for people to go back and forth with like the IOU sort of version of that, right? And so it gives you more sort of insights and control, and you're not bound by things like the data retention policies of the IOU that only limit to 3 years of data. You may have 5 years or 10 years that could be really useful. Things like that. I think that's top of mind. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. That somehow managed to be incredibly insightful, like at a high level, and also incredibly practical, like in a next steps way.